Welcome to the Intercourse Show. I'm your host, Mr. B. Today we have a very exciting show for you. We are giving you the latest developments with the Iran ceasefire negotiations that was taking place in Pakistan. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. It appears as if the U.S. and Iran could not come to terms on what negotiations to end the war would look like. So as a result, um, it has resulted in Trump alleging that there will be a blockade that is going to impose any sort of trade from happening going in or out of Iran. And it raises the stakes as to potential ships that may be stopped by that blockade. Now, for those who don't know, the moment that's been declared, that is essentially an act of war. It's a declaration of war for them to do that. Technically, the U.S. was operating under an operation, not an official declaration of war. So, what I'm going to do is play a couple videos that I think brings you up to speed with what is actually going on, and it also gives an account of what's likely to happen to the markets and potentially as a result of the conflict overall. So that being said, let's jump right into the first video. This video was done by Animated Geopolitics, and I think it was a really, really well done video that really kind of brings to speed what's actually happening. So we'll watch the video and react to it accordingly. And then there's another video that was done that frames it as maybe Iran has a bigger plan that the U.S. is walking blindly into, and lays out what's likely to happen if that is the case. So let's jump into it.
Iran said it cannot find its own mines. Then Iran walked out of the peace talks. And the people in Washington calling both of those things accidents are missing the one question that actually matters. What if neither of them was an accident at all? For 21 hours, the most powerful country on earth sat across a table from a country it says has been completely destroyed. The Vice President of the United States, the President's son-in-law, a senior envoy, 3 people across from 71 Iranian negotiators inside the Serena Hotel in Islamabad, Pakistan. Cameras outside, Pakistani security on every street, 2 national holidays declared just to make space for the most important negotiation since the war began. 21 hours. Then the Iranians stood up, packed their papers, and left the building. No deal. No agreement. No path forward. The American delegation was stunned. The Pakistani mediator was disappointed. Oil prices jumped the moment the news broke. And within hours of those talks collapsing, 2 American warships, the USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frank E. Peterson, sailed directly into the Strait of Hormuz. Without asking Iran, without coordinating with Iran, with their identification signals deliberately turned on so everyone in the world could see them moving through water that Iran was supposed to be controlling. Iran's response was immediate. The Revolutionary Guard called it a ceasefire violation, threatened severe consequences, and issued what it called a final warning. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, a story broke that almost nobody connected to the rest of it. Iran admitted, or at least an American official told the New York Times Iran was admitting, that Iran cannot find its own naval mines, the mines that Iran dropped into the Strait of Hormuz at the start of this war. The mines that are the reason commercial ships have refused to sail through those waters for 6 straight weeks. Iran's own military reportedly does not know where most of those mines are, because the Revolutionary Guard dropped them in a hurry from small boats without writing down where they went. And some of them have drifted. Currents move them. So even the coordinates Iran did write down are now wrong. That is the official version. Iran is incompetent. Iran dropped mines badly. Iran cannot find them. The Americans will have to come clean up the mess. Everybody says the same thing. I want to walk you through why I think that story is exactly the opposite of what is actually happening. Because when you line up all three events, the mines Iran cannot find, the talks Iran walked out of, and the American warships Iran let sail through without firing a single missile, you start to see a plan, not a collapse. A plan. Let us start with the talks themselves. What was actually on the table inside the Serena Hotel. The American offer, delivered by Vice President J.D. Vance, was described in the press as his final and best. Here is what it contained. Iran had to commit, in writing, that it would never seek a nuclear weapon, not reduce enrichment, not accept inspections. Commit, on paper, to never. In exchange, the United States would agree to reopen discussions on sanctions at some unspecified future date. Iran's position was the 10-point proposal we covered in our last video. Full sanctions relief immediately. $6 billion of frozen Iranian money released before negotiations even began. A permanent ceasefire extending to Lebanon. Guarantees around Iran's nuclear program that treat Iran as a country with rights rather than a defendant, and a role for Iran in managing the Strait of Hormuz going forward. The gap between those two positions is not a negotiating gap, it is a worldview gap. Vance was offering Iran a deal that treated Iran as a defeated party asking for mercy. Iran was demanding a deal that treated Iran as a sovereign country with legitimate interests. There was never going to be a bridge between those two sides in 21 hours. There was probably never going to be a bridge in 21 days. So why did Iran even show up? This is the question that matters. Because Iran did not have to send 71 people to Islamabad. Iran did not have to have the Speaker of Parliament, the Foreign Minister, the central bank governor, and a team of legal experts sit down with Vance. Iran could have declined the invitation. Iran could have said no. Instead, Iran came, talked for almost a full day, put its positions on the record, and then walked out. Here is the answer. Iran showed up because showing up was worth more than the deal itself. Every country watching this negotiation, China, Russia, India, the Gulf states, the Europeans, every government on earth that has to decide where it stands between America and Iran, needed to see who was making reasonable offers and who was refusing them. Iran walked into Islamabad with a 10-point plan that looked like a legitimate negotiating position. America walked in with an ultimatum dressed up as a deal. When the talks collapsed, Iran got to tell every government in the world a very specific story. We tried, we offered terms, America refused. That is a diplomatic weapon Iran could not get any other way. Now connect that to the mines. And stay with me, because this is where the picture starts to look very different from the official version. Iran dropped those mines in late February in the first days of the war. American officials estimated at the time that Iran had placed at least a dozen of them. These are not the simple mines of old movies, metal balls floating on chains with spikes. These are modern Iranian-made mines called the Maham-3 and the Maham-7. The Maham-3 sits anchored under the surface and detonates when its sensors detect a ship with the right profile. The Maham-7 rests on the seabed and can attach itself magnetically to a hull passing above it. Some of these mines are selective. They can be programmed to ignore small civilian boats and only target large military vessels. The official story is that Iran scattered them badly, that Iranian sailors in small fast boats rushed around the Gulf at night, dumping mines overboard without writing down coordinates, that some mines drifted with currents, that Iran, today, genuinely does not know where its own weapons are. Here is the problem with that story. Iran's navy has been laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz as a planned strategic option for over 30 years. This is not a new skill. Iran's submarines, small boats, and naval units have trained for exactly this scenario through decades of drills. The idea that the Revolutionary Guard, the most professionally disciplined military organization in Iran, simply forgot how to write down coordinates is not credible on its face. What is credible is something else. What is credible is that Iran did exactly what it wanted to do. Iran placed mines in known lanes. Iran placed some mines loosely on purpose, knowing they would drift, so that even mines that had been charted would move to unknown positions over time. Iran built a minefield that cannot be cleared by methodical coordinate by coordinate removal because there are no reliable coordinates. And then Iran turned around and told the world, through an unnamed official, that it is all a mistake. Think about the advantage that creates. If you are Iran and you tell the world, our mines are precisely placed here, here, and here, then the American Navy comes in with underwater drones and clears those exact spots. 2 weeks later, the strait is open and your leverage is gone. But if you tell the world, we don't know where the mines are, some of them drifted, nobody has a map, then the American Navy has to search every single square kilometer of the shipping lanes, and every ship captain has to assume the next meter of water could have a mine in it. The first story costs you your leverage in 2 weeks. The second story preserves it for months. Any competent military strategist, given those two choices, picks the second one every time. That is not incompetence. That is permanent, deniable deterrence. Every American minesweeper that enters those waters now has to assume every square meter could have a mine in it. Every oil tanker captain weighing whether to transit has to factor in the fact that mines may drift into the lane he planned to use. The insurance costs stay impossible. The supply of oil stays tight. The prices stay high. And I want to pause here to connect this to your life because this is not an abstract story about a faraway war. This is the reason your bills look the way they do right now. Gas in the United States is $4.17 a gallon on average. In some parts of the country, it is over $7. That is a 37% increase since this war began on February 28th. The March jump alone, 21% in a single month, is the largest monthly increase in gas prices since 1967, the year the United States started tracking it reliably. Fuel oil, to the stuff that heats American homes, went up 31% in 1 month. Airfares are up 15%. Consumer confidence in the United States just hit 47.6, the lowest number ever recorded, lower than the worst moment of the pandemic, lower than 2008, lower than any point measured in modern American economic history. There is also, right now, a developing shortage of jet fuel in parts of the country because the global supply chain that fills American airports runs through Gulf refineries, and Gulf refineries run on oil that cannot get to them. A family in America that drives a normal amount is paying over $1,200 more per year on gas alone compared to 2 months ago. Nobody voted for that. Nobody in Washington campaigned on that. It is happening because a country the United States says it has destroyed is controlling the flow of oil through a narrow strip of water by convincing the world it cannot find its own weapons. Here is the question I want to put to you because people watching this are going to split on it, and that split is worth having out loud. Iran just walked out of a 21-hour negotiation after refusing to sign a commitment it will never build a nuclear weapon. On the same day, American officials are telling the press that Iran cannot find the mines it dropped in its own waters. Are these two events an accident? A country that is disorganized and losing control of its own military playing at diplomacy and failing? Or are they one single coordinated strategy? A country that planned exactly this outcome and is getting exactly what it wanted. Write accident or strategy in the comments. And when someone writes the opposite of what you chose, tell them why they are wrong. Because the answer to that question is the answer to where this war actually goes from here. Now, let me show you what happened after the talks ended, because this is where the picture gets even stranger. The USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frank E. Peterson, two American guided missile destroyers, each of them a serious naval weapon, sailed into the Strait of Hormuz. They crossed from the Arabian Sea into the Gulf, and then they sailed back out again. They did it with their identification signals turned on, so any Iranian radar operator could see them. They did it without coordinating with Iran. They did it as a message. The American Central Command announced it publicly. The United States is starting a mine clearance operation in the strait, and the ships are the first step. Trump said publicly that the United States is doing this as a favor to countries all over the world, including China, Japan, South Korea, France, Germany, and many others. He said American warships sank 28 Iranian mine-laying boats. He posted on social media that empty oil tankers from around the world are heading to the United States to buy American oil instead of Gulf oil. Iran's response? The Revolutionary Guard threatened what it called a final warning, said it would deal severely with military vessels, called the crossing a ceasefire violation, and then did nothing. The American warships completed their transit without a single mine detonating, without a single missile being fired at them, without a single Iranian patrol boat intercepting them. Think about what that tells you. If Iran's minefield were truly uncontrolled, if mines were drifting randomly and Iran did not know where they were, there was a real chance one of those American ships would have hit one. They did not. The mines stayed exactly where Iran wanted them to stay. The warships went exactly where Iran let them go. And Iran's threats, for all the heat of the language, stayed just threats. That is not a country that has lost control of its own waters. That is a country that is choosing which ships to let through and in what order to make a point. There is one more detail that almost nobody is putting together with the rest of this picture, and it is the detail that ties all of it back to Washington. Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister, Netanyahu, canceled what was supposed to be his 7th visit to the White House since Trump returned to office. He was scheduled to attend AIPAC, a major conference in Washington. He was going to join a peace council meeting with Trump. He skipped all of it. The stated reason was heightened tensions with Iran and domestic protests in Israel. The unstated reason, according to people who cover Israeli politics closely, is that Netanyahu did not want to be photographed with Trump at a moment when Trump's Iran strategy is collapsing publicly, and Netanyahu is continuing Lebanon strikes that Pakistan and Iran consider ceasefire violations. Netanyahu said the campaign against Iran is not finished. Israel struck another 200 targets inside Lebanon over the past day. This is where the story stands today. The talks collapsed. The warships crossed. The mines stayed. The bombing continues. And Iran, the country everyone keeps calling destroyed, is sitting on top of the flow of global oil, having just refused a deal that would have required it to give up the one thing every country with nuclear enemies eventually builds. Here is the last question I want to leave with you, and this one is the one that matters most for understanding what happens next. The ceasefire expires on April 22nd, 10 days from now. If no deal is reached, the bombs resume. Trump has said he will resume with even greater force than before. Iran has said it will shut the Strait of Hormuz completely. When that deadline arrives, do you think Iran will come back to the table and accept the deal it just rejected? Or do you think Iran will let the deadline pass, absorb the next wave of bombing, and bet that the economic pain inflicted through Hormuz will break America's political will before America's bombs break Iran? Right comes back, or lets it pass, in the comments. I want to see where the argument lands. Because here is what I think you just heard. I think you heard the story of a country that has been written off by every news channel and every official in Washington and is using that exact narrative, that it is destroyed, defeated, incompetent, as cover for a strategy that is working. Iran did not lose its mines. Iran scattered them on purpose and then told the world it lost them. Iran did not fail at the talks. Iran walked in, put reasonable terms on the record, and walked out knowing every government on earth would see who refused peace. Iran is absorbing real damage every single day, and Iran is also at the same time setting the conditions of a war the United States no longer controls. Neither the mines nor the walkout was an accident. Both were the same plan, running in parallel, designed to look like chaos from the outside and function like strategy from the inside. That is the story nobody on mainstream news is telling, and it is the story that explains everything that is going to happen over the next 10 days. If you want the full picture of exactly how those mines work, why the American Navy is struggling to clear them, and what the actual technical challenge in the Strait looks like, we covered that on our second channel, Animated Military. The newest video there breaks down step by step why the United States Navy cannot simply sweep the Strait of Hormuz clean, and what it actually takes to find a mine that nobody wrote down the location of. Watch that next. It is the piece of this story that connects what happens at the negotiating table in Islamabad to what happens on the water at 2 a.m. when a tanker captain has to decide whether to trust the charts.
Okay, so there you have it. I think This channel did a phenomenal job of giving us some insight that most people would not give you, or most people would not find on mainstream media, right? Iran is not a country that is, a stupid country. They know what they're doing. Even though we are breaking a lot of things within that country, we are demolishing them in a lot of ways with our bombs. We have caused a lot of damage, and a lot of people have passed. These people have been planning this for 40 plus years. They've been planning a confrontation. They expected this from us. And so as a result, they are playing out their plan. And what you can see by how this war is going is that they've put some thought into things, right? It is not going as quickly as Donald Trump predicted. And it's looking messy because we're at another escalation point. With that said, there's another video that I found. Excuse me. That I thought was pretty good. And this video speaks about what is likely to happen next, how this situation may escalate. Now, this was done by Vantage Ledger, so I want to give them some shout out. I thought they did a great job at this video, but I thought it's important to share, what they thought about this. I think I'm having a little
consequences. Nobody announced it on the evening news. No press conference, no briefing room, no ambassador standing at a podium, choosing words carefully because words at podiums have consequences. It came through a social media post, and in the time it takes to read a single paragraph on your phone, the most economically critical 33 kilometers of water on the entire planet became a declared military confrontation zone between the United States Navy and the one country that has spent the last 2 decades building its entire military identity around the answer to exactly this moment. Think about that sequence. Talks collapse in Islamabad. Within hours, not days, hours, a blockade order appears on Truth Social. The U.S. Navy is now instructed to physically prevent commercial vessels from transiting the Strait of Hormuz if those vessels have paid Iranian transit fees. 17 million barrels of oil per day move through that strait. Every drop of crude Japan needs, every LNG cargo Qatar ships to Europe, every barrel South Korea, Taiwan, and India depend on to keep their industrial economies alive. All of it moves through 33 kilometers of water that, as of this morning, is the site of a declared American naval blockade. Here's the thing. The word blockade is already being used in coverage like it's just a policy tool, like it's a strongly worded sanction with boats attached. It is not. Under international maritime law, a blockade of an international strait is classified as an act of war, not a gray area, not a legal debate, an act of war. The United States just announced it is conducting one, and the country on the other side of that announcement has anti-ship missile batteries positioned along the northern shore, a mine inventory that experts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies have described as among the most sophisticated in the region, and military commanders who, according to U.S. Naval Institute reporting, have been on elevated readiness since late February. So here's the question that nobody in the official coverage is actually asking. What if the blockade isn't the trap being set for Iran? What if Iran is the one who built the trap? And what if the United States just walked directly into it? Stay with me. The version of this story that most people will absorb goes something like this. Iran has been extracting transit fees from commercial vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran calls it a sovereign right. Washington calls it extortion. Talks in Islamabad, the last serious diplomatic thread keeping the ceasefire framework from unraveling entirely, collapsed. And the president, out of patience with what he publicly described as Iran's bad faith, ordered the Navy to enforce a blockade. Maximum pressure applied at the moment of maximum diplomatic failure. That version is not wrong, but it is profoundly, dangerously incomplete. Let's build the full picture, because the details that get left out of the short version are precisely the ones that determine whether this ends with Iran backing down or with 17 million barrels a day coming off the global market overnight. The transit fee issue is real. Iran began demanding what it described as a security passage contribution from commercial tankers in the Strait approximately 6 weeks ago. The amounts varied. Vessels flagged to certain nations paid more. Some carriers refused and rerouted around the strait entirely. adding 9 to 14 days and significant cost to journeys that were already disrupted by the conflict. But here is the part of that story that the blockade announcement just made significantly more complicated. Many vessels paid the fees, not rogue operators, not sanction busters. Legitimate commercial carriers, some flagged to U.S. allied nations, made the calculation that paying was cheaper than not transiting. That paying was the only way to honor their contracts, avoid cargo defaults, and keep their business relationships intact in a war zone they did not create. The blockade order, as announced, would subject those vessels that made legally and commercially defensible decisions under duress, to U.S. Navy interdiction. The shipping industry woke up this morning to a policy that has retroactively criminalized the survival decisions of companies operating in a conflict they had no part in starting. The reaction from shipping associations was immediate. The Baltic and International Maritime Council issued an emergency advisory to its member operators within 3 hours of the announcement. The International Chamber of Shipping put out a statement describing the situation as, and I want to use their specific language here, an untenable operational environment for commercial maritime operations. These are not political organizations making political statements. These are the people who actually move the physical stuff the global economy runs on, and they are telling their members, in the careful but unmistakable language of industry bodies that never use dramatic words unless they mean them, that they do not know how to operate in the waters. The U.S. just declared a military interdiction zone. Here is what the energy market heard in that message. Oil futures moved the moment the announcement broke. Brent crude jumped. The market was not pricing in Iranian oil specifically being cut off. Iranian exports had already been heavily restricted for months. The market was pricing in something far more serious. It was pricing in the possibility that the entire commercial shipping architecture of the Persian Gulf, the system through which a third of the world's seaborne oil trades, is now operating under military threat from both directions simultaneously. Iran on one side, the U.S. Navy on the other, and 33 kilometers of water between them that every tanker in the region has to either cross or avoid. You might be thinking, this is a negotiating tactic, maximum pressure. The U.S. has done this before, applied overwhelming economic and military coercion to force a counterparty back to the table. The logic is coherent. Tehran's economy is under severe stress. Iranian popular sentiment about the conflict is not uniformly supportive of the government's position. A blockade that further squeezes Iranian revenue might produce exactly the kind of internal pressure that forces a return to Islamabad on American terms. That logic might be correct. But here's the one detail in this story that changes the entire calculation. And it is a detail that I have not seen addressed directly in any of the official coverage today. Iran did not react to this blockade announcement with alarm. According to reports from 3 regional correspondents tracking Iranian state media and official communications this morning, the initial Iranian government response was not the urgent, aggressive counter-messaging you would expect from a government caught off guard by an escalatory move. It was measured. It was almost calm. And that calm, coming from a government whose entire maritime strategy has been oriented toward this exact scenario for 20 years, should be the most alarming signal in this entire story, because it suggests something that most of the coverage is not ready to say out loud yet. Iran was not surprised. I want to sit with that for a second before moving on, because the implications are significant and they move in a direction that most of the framing around this blockade announcement has completely missed. The US just deployed its most powerful coercive tool in the maritime domain, a naval blockade, the thing that, in conventional strategic logic, should have Iran's leadership in crisis mode, running emergency response scenarios, scrambling to manage an escalation they weren't prepared for. And the response was calm. Here is why. And this is the part that I was genuinely reluctant to say out loud when I first worked through it, because it sounds almost too convenient to be true. But the evidence for it is not obscure. It is documented, it is public, and it has been sitting in plain sight in strategic studies literature for years. Iran's entire military posture in the Strait of Hormuz was designed specifically to be triggered by a US blockade. Not to survive a blockade, not to resist one, to be triggered by one. The Iranians have a doctrine. It has a name. It is called Mosaic Defense, and it was developed through the late 1990s and early 2000s in direct response to American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf. The doctrine's central insight is this: Iran cannot defeat the US Navy in a conventional naval engagement. It cannot outgun American carrier groups. It cannot win a symmetrical fight at sea. And so Iran never built a force designed to win that fight. Instead, Iran built a force designed to make winning that fight cost more than it's worth. Mosaic defense in the Strait means this: hundreds of small, fast attack craft operating in swarms that US Navy combat systems were not designed to track simultaneously. Shore-based anti-ship missile batteries, the Noor, the Qatar, the more recent Nasr systems, positioned along a northern coastline that provides Iran a firing solution on virtually every point in the Strait's navigable channel. an undersea mine inventory that the Office of Naval Intelligence, in a report published in 2022 and still publicly available, estimated at over 5,000 mines, including influence mines with programmable activation signatures. And this is the part that the blockade announcement just activated, a legal and strategic framework that frames any U.S. naval enforcement action in the Strait as the act of aggression that justifies Iran using all of it. Iran's military planners have understood for 20 years that the one thing they needed to deploy their full asymmetric capability without triggering universal international condemnation was a legitimate casus belli, a clear, documented, internationally recognized act of aggression by the United States against Iranian sovereign interests in the Strait. A blockade is exactly that. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, under the 1958 Geneva Convention on the High Seas, under the customary international law of naval warfare, a blockade of an international strait triggers Article 51 of the UN Charter. It gives Iran the legal right to respond with force in self-defense, not as an aggressor, not as the party escalating, as the party defending against an illegal act of war. Iran's commanders do not need to sell this internally as aggression. They can present every military action they take in the Strait, every missile fired, every mine laid, every fast attack swarm launched, as a legally defensible act of national defense against a blockade that the United Nations' own legal framework classifies as illegal. The trap was not set this morning. It was set over 2 decades, methodically, by a military establishment that studied American doctrine and understood that the one scenario Washington would eventually reach for was exactly this one. Commander James Fennell, former director of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, has described Iran's Strait strategy in testimony before the House Intelligence Committee as, in his words, the most thoroughly prepared area denial environment the United States Navy has ever faced. He said that in 2019. The systems he was describing have been upgraded since. The viewer understanding this story through the lens of American coercive power, the powerful Navy squeezing the weaker regional state into compliance, has the image exactly backwards. The 33 kilometers of the Strait of Hormuz are not open water where American naval dominance operates freely. They are a prepared battle space where Iran has spent 2 decades positioning the military, legal, and strategic architecture for exactly this confrontation. The U.S. didn't back Iran into a corner this morning. It walked into one. Here's the variable that almost nobody is tracking right now. And I mean that genuinely. I've gone through coverage from Reuters, AP, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, and the Naval War College's strategic commentary feed today. The Iran analysis, the oil price analysis, the legal analysis, all present. But this variable, the one I'm about to describe, is either buried in the final paragraph of long-form pieces or absent entirely from mainstream coverage. China has tankers in those waters right now, not hypothetically, not as a future risk scenario. Right now, today, Chinese flagged vessels and vessels operated by Chinese state energy companies are either transiting or preparing to transit the Strait of Hormuz, because China is the single largest purchaser of Gulf crude. Chinese energy security runs directly through those 33 kilometers. And China, unlike the United States, has been purchasing Iranian oil throughout this conflict, at discounted prices, through arrangements that sidestep Western sanctions infrastructure, in volumes that have kept parts of the Iranian economy functioning under conditions that would otherwise have been crippling. Now the United States has announced a blockade that, as written, could authorize U.S. Navy vessels to interdict Chinese-flagged tankers that have paid Iranian transit fees. Let me be very precise about what that means, because this is not a hypothetical legal thought experiment. This is an operational scenario with a real probability attached. If a U.S. Navy vessel physically stops, boards, or redirects a Chinese state-owned tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, that is not a U.S.-Iran incident. That is a U.S.-China incident. And it occurs in a context where Beijing has been watching this conflict with what analysts at the Lowy Institute have described as pedagogical intensity, studying American operational behavior in the Gulf the way you study a subject you expect to examine under pressure in a different theater at a later date. Beijing's response to being physically interdicted in an international strait would not be diplomatic protest through the UN Security Council. It would begin there. But China holds U.S. Treasury debt. China controls the manufacturing supply chains that American consumer prices depend on. China has its own freedom of navigation calculations in the South China Sea that the United States challenges regularly, and those challenges have until now operated within an understood framework of escalation management. A U.S. Navy blockade that touches Chinese commercial shipping blows that framework apart. Nicholas Szczeciny at the Center for Strategic and International Studies has been writing about the China-Gulf energy nexus for years. His analysis is clear and worth understanding. China treats its energy supply lines as a core national security interest. An interdiction of Chinese vessels in Hormuz would be processed in Beijing not as a trade dispute or legal disagreement, but as a direct attack on Chinese national security equities. The response would be calibrated, but it would not be passive. Here's the second wild card: the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. These governments export through the strait. Their economies depend on it functioning. And they have been trying, with considerable diplomatic effort and real personal political risk, to maintain a balance between their American security relationship and a workable regional arrangement with Iran. The blockade doesn't complicate that balance, it destroys it. Because a U.S. Navy blockade of the strait doesn't just threaten Iranian vessels. It threatens every vessel transiting waters adjacent to Gulf state territory. Saudi crude moves through it. Qatari LNG moves through it. The UAE's entire trade architecture moves through it. These governments are now in the position of watching their primary security guarantor physically threaten the commercial arteries that fund their national budgets. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's government has already been making moves toward China that have unsettled Washington. The Huawei infrastructure decisions, the yuan-denominated oil trade discussions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization engagement. A blockade that visibly damages Saudi economic interests while benefiting no Gulf state creates the precise conditions under which Riyadh accelerates those moves and frames them publicly as a necessary hedge against American policy unpredictability. The United States has spent 70 years building a Gulf alliance architecture. A blockade that simultaneously threatens Gulf state commercial shipping, creates a potential U.S.-China confrontation, and hands Iran the legal justification for its full asymmetric military response is not pressure on Iran. It is pressure on every relationship the United States has ever built in the region. All of it, at once. And the calculation behind it was announced through a social media post.
Okay, so there you have it. Donald Trump put himself in quite a conundrum. Iran went there to be strategic in terms of what they want the world to believe about them and their country. They want a world to believe that they are the victims of a problem that the U.S. and Israel started, and that they since then has made reasonable efforts to resolve the matter, despite the fact that they have been illegally attacked and they are technically defending themselves. And despite the efforts they've made, the U.S. continues to demand that they essentially bow and, pretty much admit defeat. And what we've learned from these videos is that they are not taking that position. In fact, they're choosing to play the long game with the intended purpose of hurting the U.S. And the more pompous the U.S. gets in thinking that they can just exert their authority and their size and their military supremacy over them, then it's going to mean that they're really playing to the other countries that's kind of sitting on the sidelines right now. The Russias, the Chinas, these are big nuclear armed countries, the Indias. They're sitting on the sideline kind of watching how these things play out. Even some of the NATO allies are kind of watching how this thing is playing out, and they're really kind of picking a side. And what Iran is trying to show is we're being reasonable. We're trying to come to the table to make peace. We were unprovoked, right? We're the victims. That's essentially the position that they're trying to take. And so that one of these 3 or 4 countries, you have the new North Koreas, who's already aligned their support for Iran. You have Russia, who's leaning towards supporting Iran. And you have China, who's leaning towards supporting Iran, but it's kind of in the middle of the conflict. And so once those countries say enough is enough and starts to militarily stand with Iran, now the problem becomes bigger than it than it seems, and more unmanageable for the US. Again, said simply, that I think they're buying more and more time to involve other superpowers into the matter. Now, I like the analysis that was done, the last one, because it talks about what are the likely scenarios that's going to take place. The moment the Strait of Hormuz has the blockade from the US, that means the US is going to start stopping all ships that goes through, including the Chinese ships. The moment the Chinese ships start to get confronted, they may not take a passive reaction. They may choose to exert their political tool to combat the problem, which is likely to happen. So either they'll use, trading tools, the fact that they control the majority of certain minerals. They have tools that they can use to fight back, if not militarily. But it's only but so long China can sit on the sidelines while the U.S. attempts to starve them of the fuel that they will need in order to be productive and to support their billion-plus people. So the longer this drags out, the more likely it is that China will see the U.S. as the one who's provoking the problem, and probably align with Iran. And this is what's being spelled out here. But also, there's other videos that's also showing that, Iran is really a formidable country. Some could even say a superpower, because who would have thought they had that much leverage that they could have used to disrupt global economies and really cause a economic squeeze on their enemies. I don't think anyone really anticipated the measure of resolve that these guys had to stand up and fight for themselves. These are people who are a dignified society that existed long before the U.S. was ever reformed. So these people are, prideful. They're a civilization that's existed for a long time, and so they've been resilient for a reason. So they have every right to fight for their existence. Whether you agree with the cause of the war or not, it's clear and evident that our leaders and Israeli leaders disagree with the leaders that Iran have. But, Iran seemed to have been its own self-sustaining country that has been withstanding all the sanctions and things that's been put against them for many years, and they've somehow survived. Despite the fact that that's happened, even when they're threatened militarily by a far superior military force, they still stand up for themselves. So you have to respect their resolve to fight for their dignity and for their right to exist. And I just think, my honest opinion is that this is getting out of hand quick. And there's egos here. It seems like everything Donald Trump tries ends up kind of blowing up in his face in a little bit. He thought he was going to get a quick resolution by bombing them. And unfortunately, their regime are still intact and is still in place and essentially fighting back. Right now, it's different people at the helm because they killed a lot of their leaders, but they still taking the same positions, and the people have not risen up against them. I think the new calculation now is that the U.S. can do the same thing to them that they're, I think, essentially doing to Cuba, where they're starving them out, in terms of their energy resources and things of that nature, so that the people can get so fed up that they now rebel against their own government. So the problem happens internally more so than externally. I think that's what their calculation is on the blockade. But if the Iranians get desperate in having to deal with internal uprisings, they could just continue to attack those U.S. ships, of which they framed the situation in such a way that their people are more so likely to side with them than they are to side with the U.S., in my view. And the reason why is because, you know, if the Iranian leader says, hey, the reason you guys don't have food is because of the blockade they put on you, it's not because of us. The reason you guys aren't supported is because they're, you know, destroying our infrastructure. They're attacking our, you know, facilities that provides electricity and all these energy resources that you guys have, right? So now the people will most likely be angry and most likely join to fight against Iran. Now, that's not to say that there won't be some people who defect, but I think it's more likely than not that if they perceive that, you know, this group of people is coming against us, that they'll likely will resist. All I have to say is look at Afghanistan. From what I've seen in Afghanistan, even though they were occupied for like 20 years, those people ultimately stood with the government we were trying to overthrow, the Taliban. 20 years later, we're being chased out of that country. And the people that we replaced went right back into power and is continuing business as usual. So even though there was a 20-year interval of foreign interference in their affairs, they're right back to their original system. So then the question is, what was the point of us doing that? It's that we're essentially trying to infuse democracy in systems that don't want it. I mean, that's just the simplest way I could put that. And I think that's where it gets tricky. So again, I'm always going to encourage everyone to pray for our leaders so that we have the right leaders in place making the right decisions for the country, because these decisions ultimately have real life effects on all of us, right? I just try to give some perspective outside of what the mainstream media is telling us. I know that there's parts of the story that may not get included in their coverage. So the curiosity side of me, you know, tries to find balanced information to consider so that I can make informed decisions. And I think it's only right that I share it with my subscribers who have supported my channel. We're approaching about 10,000 subscribers, so I'm grateful for you guys. And I'm going to request for those of you who come across my videos and have yet to subscribe to the show, I encourage you to like and subscribe and just get connected so you can join the conversation and weigh in. That being said, I'm Mr. B. I thank you for joining me for this take on the latest developments with the ceasefire peace agreements, as well as what's likely to happen. Please support some of the channels that I've mentioned prior, and stay connected. And also, you know, if you're people of faith, raise our leaders up in prayer so that they can, you know, do what's right for their people and not continue to fight senseless wars that really leads to nowhere and, you know, leads to people losing their life. All right, that's it for me, guys. Thank you again for sharing your time with me. I want to stay consistent with sharing as much developments as I come across that I think would be useful for you guys to understand. So stay connected and let's keep our leaders in prayer. All right, guys. Have a blessed one.